However, the accent is the sort of natural accent of each word. If we were pronouncing it as prose, where would we stress the word? And the answer is, in Latin, you stress every word on the penultimate syllable, either next to last syllable, if that syllable is long, but if that syllable is short, you take the stress back one further to the antepenultimate, either the, not the one before the end, but the one before that. And that, again, is a very regular rule. So the ictus and the accent, these two kinds of stress, are always going to coincide at the end if we have a 2 or 3 syllable word at the end. And this is the main reason why we do that. So if you've got a 2 syllable word like that, it's going to be stressed there. And so that's the accent, the natural stress of the word. That's the ictus, the beat of the verse, and they're coinciding. The same is also inevitably going to happen if you've got a 3 syllable word, because it's always going to be stressed there, if that's a long syllable. What we want is for that to happen in the 5th foot as well. And if you did that, it's not going to happen. You're going to have a word that's naturally stressed. It's a 2 syllable word. Obviously, the stress can't go any further back than that. So it's going to have its accent there, but the ictus there. And this is particularly horrid if you do have a word longer than 1 syllable there, because however long it is, I mean, let's say it's a 2 syllable word. Again, it's going to have its accent there, but the ictus of the verse, if that's the 4th foot, is going to be there. In other words, the whole thing is going to get jumbled up at the end of the line, don't you?
Is this just less desirable in the last 2 feet? Or?
Yeah, we're talking about the end of the verse only. At the beginning of the verse, it is positively desirable for the accent and the ictus to conflict. I mean, this is one of the really subtle and, I mean, it's a bit like sort of musical syncopation. Not that I'm a jazz musician or anything, I don't understand it really, but some kind of slight sort of lack of ease at the beginning, which comes together neatly and smoothly at the end, is what makes the hexameter such a sort of subtle and powerful meter. I mean, well, take the most famous opening of all. I expect this is moderately familiar to most of you. If we're thinking of the ictus, obviously it falls at the beginning of each foot. But if we think of the accent, well, it's not always coinciding. I mean, it's quite often it is, quite often it isn't. And that's the charm and the point of hexameter writing, I think. You don't want it to be that every single foot, the natural stress of the word and the beat of the verse is coinciding, because that's very, very dull. You need a bit of tension between these two kinds of stress in the first half of the verse, and you want them to come together neatly at the end. So, I mean, this is obviously a very famous line of Virgil and totally normal. In this particular case, that there they coincide, but there they definitely don't. And that gives a little bit more sort of interest to it just before the caesura, and the same applies just after it. That's the 3rd foot, of course, that's the caesura, that's the end of the 3rd foot. So that's obviously a long syllable, it is stressed, but it's not where the ictus of the verse goes. The ictus of the verse is on the O of Cano, but the natural stress on of the words on the A of Cano, on that syllable of Troiae. So we've got, in both the 3rd and the 4th foot, we've got the ictus and the accent not coinciding. At the end of the verse, they do coincide. This is something we can talk about further if people are not familiar with it. Again, this is old hat, I know, to many of you, quite familiar, but perhaps a new concept to some of you. Peter?
Question, a tangent on this. In antiquity, the Romans would have recited this either way?
I'm not an expert on Roman practice, but yeah, I think when you're reciting verse, a judicious mixture of attention to both kinds of stress is desirable. In other words, it's very, very boring if you put total emphasis on the ictus arma verumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris. Sounds horrid. On the other hand, if you just read it as prose, I think that's also not so desirable because well, some people do that, but then the sense of the verse doesn't really come through very neatly. So I think it's quite a difficult and subtle issue, and I'm not sure I have any easy answer to it. And in my own practice, I just try and be aware of both. And maybe, actually, I tend to err a little bit on the side of stressing the verse rhythm rather than the prose stress. But other people prefer it the other way around, and I quite see why. So arma verumque cano Troiae qui primus ab oris is what I would say. And actually, when I'm pronouncing that, I do give a little bit of stress on the A of Troiae, knowing perfectly well that the prose accent is on the first syllable. Because I think actually the ictus of the fourth foot is where the sort of hexameter gathers its strength and comes alive again. After the caesura, it's a sort of point where it is getting going, it's got a bit of force towards the end. So there's no easy answer to the how to read verse aloud question. I think what matters is, well, making it sound like poetry, making the meaning come through, pleasing yourself and your listeners, and that's a matter of taste more than there being a right answer. But yeah, I think trying to keep some attention to both simultaneously, I think is perhaps the answer. Any other questions related to that? I say, if it's a bit confusing, don't worry too much. We can certainly talk about it later, and you can talk to fellow participants who may be sort of more familiar with these terms. Okay. Well, let me just quickly sort of turn from technical matters to matters of what we're writing about and sort of inspiration. Obviously, well, I mean, the one point of our art gallery visit this afternoon is to have a bit of a break, go somewhere nice, see some nice pictures for their own sake. I mean, I love look at pictures, so pure pleasure for me anyway. But in terms of the poetry we're writing, it's perhaps something that, I mean, I do suggest you go around with a pen and a piece of paper and jot down ideas as they come to you as you look at the things we're looking at. And what I'm trying to encourage you to think about is what sort of ideas can we get from an outside source of inspiration that we may not have thought about before. And I think art is quite useful in that respect because if we're not familiar with a picture, obviously this is a new thing to us and we can respond to it in a variety of ways. Obviously, if we were doing some art criticism of it, that would be one thing. And so we can respond to it in quite a sort of, I don't know, sort of technical or sort of analytical way. In terms of art, well, what can we say? We can be descriptive. We can be sort of analytical or critical. In other words, we can just say, that's an interesting picture, why don't we describe what the content of the picture is? That might make a reasonable little poem. We could also respond to it in a more critical way, and, well, we could either argue with the artist, perhaps, or say, I don't see the point of that. I'm not necessarily that's a bad picture, but that raises something that I can argue against. Or you can find something that is worth analysing in that picture, something that stimulates you. Or you can perhaps sort of look at a small or sort of comic element to it. I mean, often I think it's the little details which make sort of interesting poems. So I think sort of attention to detail in the outside world is often the sort of thing that is worth our looking at. So any of these things are worth your keeping your eyes open for, jotting down on a piece of paper, talking to fellow participants about. I mean, if two or three of you are standing in front of a picture, you might ask each other, well, what is it about this picture that we might start making a poem about? Would we want to just describe it, or are the colours nice? Is the composition nice? That sort of thing. Or we might say, well, this is a picture that, well, maybe even alludes in some way to a political issue or a historical issue that interests us, so maybe we might sort of stray from the actual picture and just use as a starting point for discussing perhaps some quite different things which in some way are inspired by it. So I'm thinking of sort of sources of inspiration and how disparate and different they actually can be. Obviously, you've all chosen something to do your first poem on, and probably you've got a few alternative ideas already down. But this is just to suggest a few extra things that you might be thinking about. In terms of the ideas that it is worth your having and discussing with other people, you might like to think of something serious, something comic. In other words, a little amusing thing might make a nice comic poem, and something that actually matters to you deeply might, if you feel like writing about it, might make rather a good serious subject. And again, you might think of some historical subject, you might think of some contemporary subject. Again, a variety of sources of inspiration is quite desirable. So, I mean, I really do approve of frivolity. So, I mean, the comic and frivolous, I think, for short poems that we're doing really is quite a good subject for Latin poetry, I think. So, maybe you might make it as one of your targets for the afternoon at the museum to find something that really does amuse you a bit. I mean, a frivolous aspect to one of these pictures that might make an entertaining poem, and, well, one person's sort of serious or moving picture might raise a bit of frivolity in somebody else. There's plenty of possibilities here, I think. So a bit of both, I think, is desirable. As to what kind of poems we might be wanting to write, I think I might repeat some of the previous advice. Keep it simple in terms of what you're trying to say. I mean, it really is easier if you keep the basic point you're making relatively simple and relatively flexible. In other words, don't get too tied down to a particular form of expression of saying what you want. Think of what you're trying to say in pretty general terms, and then find some Latin words which are going to fit that idea, and most importantly, fit into the verse structure. So being simple and being flexible, I think, is better than excessive complication. And nevertheless, I mean, do sort of be to the point in terms of being brief and effective, but also have a point that you're making. There's got to be something that you're really saying in the poem that's preferably not totally obvious, and that certainly in comic and frivolous poetry is something that is a little bit amusing, I think, is a desirable point to be making. If you want a really frivolous target for your poetry during the rest of the week, I might suggest slightly sneakily the insertion of a made-up word of my own invention. This was, I don't approve of your making up Latin words in general. I mean, names, yes, but other words, no. Nevertheless, if you all want to do me a small favour, you might fit into at least one poem the invented word gaffari, which in other words, gaffor. First, declension deponent, gaffatus participle, gaffatus sum, and ego saepissime gaffatus sum. I've often made a fool of myself. Gaffari means to make a gaff or a mistake, and I think it's rather a useful new word, and it was coined by a group of us in Rome last year, of which Petrus Australianus was a distinguished member. So, yeah, and well, obviously you could have a noun, gaffer, if you want, which is a gaff or mistake, or cock up, as we say in English, possibly say in America too. So that's quite an amusing word, I think, and if you can slip it into your poems, that's a new invented word that I will definitely accept with pleasure.